Oh, I always do this. Hi, everybody. Once again, I forgot to change who we are, which is funny because we're not really Tuesdays with Kamira, as you can tell. Kamira usually does Tuesdays, but we swapped them for logistical reasons. So I'm here today, and it is Tuesdays with Sue today. So welcome, everybody. Today, we are speaking with Dr. Robert Faris, who is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Davis, who studies many things, but what we're going to focus on today is why teens bully each other. So Bob and I have been talking for years, and he's one of my favorite guests because his research is so fascinating. It's like unearthing this web of information that we just don't really understand. Anyway, so thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see you.
All right, let's dig into your new stuff. So it seems like you're having a hard time using the word bullying, and I mean defining the word bullying, that's gotten a little more complicated for you, and you're leaning toward the word aggression. So can you explain that? And maybe I'm saying it wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, but also just explain what you're describing now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, actually, I've had kind of like a real change of heart. For the longest time, that was my position, that I really I didn't feel like the widely accepted academic definition of bullying was very useful for me, and that in a nutshell requires that bullying be from someone who is more powerful directed towards someone who's less powerful, that it has to be repeated over time, and it's intentional harm doing, which that part is fine, but it's the emphasis on repetition in particular, I thought was misplaced, because I've heard of just horrible, and disastrous things that have arisen out of a single rumor, a text message, and so I felt that was, both too narrow and also in some ways too broad, so I just kind of sidestepped it and focused, on used a more general term of aggression. But recently I've been, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm old enough to, I don't know, not care as much, but I recently, published a piece. It will be coming out in a book on the sociology of bullying. It'll be coming out, I think, in May or June, and in which I make a case for revising the accepted definition. So I'm trying to reclaim the term, and because I do think it has so much rhetorical power. It has a visceral kind of emotion behind it, that a relatability. I don't want to give it up. I mean, I do think it's an important term, and I think I just think we need to rethink how we define it. So what I've proposed is that, to me, it's bullying is not necessarily, doesn't have to be repeated, but I think it's more a better way of thinking about it is that it's an interaction between people who have reason to encounter each other again. It may not ever be repeated, and to me, it doesn't have to be repeated to be bullying. It's the fact that they will be encountering each other, on a routine basis, and
so the damage could be done with one act, but right, you will have to keep seeing that person.
Right. And aggression is too broad. In my mind, bullying is something more specific, and I think for me, the crux of it is really about cruelty. And there's something, this unnecessary kind of twist of the knife that to me feels like, that's the heart of bullying. Harm doing, lots of things are harmful, but I don't think, like, yeah, it's harmful to, steal something from another kid's locker, but I don't think that's bullying.
Okay, so cruelty. So just tell us, like, what would you use now in your research as the criteria for whatever, if you're calling it bullying or aggression? What would the criteria be?
Is it an act of cruelty that is occurring between people who have reason to encounter each other again, to expect to encounter each other again? So a passing remark directed at a stranger does not qualify. It has to be people who are kind of stuck together in some
okay. All right. So now I know you talk about physical, verbal, and indirect, right? Those still remain under the rubric. So do you see that one of those ways is more damaging?
In my research, what we found, for a long time, psychologists, had the kind of cornered the market on bullying research, and they spent a lot of time really kind of parsing out the different types and coming up with typologies. And and so I followed that model in my data collection and made sure that we were, denoting these different categories. What we found in our data is that the majority of bullying ties between kids involve more than one type of aggression. So they weren't as specialized as I might have expected given the prior literature. So what we're finding basically is that kids are using multiple methods. Verbal abuse is the most commonly used. Indirect aggression is next, and then physical aggression is third. And I do find some differences in their consequences. Ironically, I think the one that the sort of naive viewer might think is the most serious would be physical violence, and that's actually in our data suggests that's both the least common and also the least damaging in terms of the social emotional trauma that arises from it. It's the least effective. So a lot of what my research has been oriented around is trying to understand, what are the underlying dynamics of aggression or bullying? Why is it occurring? And a lot of what we're finding is what we found is that a lot of it is instrumental, not all of it. A lot of it is intended for the climbing of social ladders, and the least effective form of bullying for doing that is physical violence.
Oh, that's so interesting. So I want to go back to earlier research because I always found this so fascinating. You found that there was a lack of reciprocity in high school kids when you talked about friendship. Can you explain that just as a starting point before we get into more bullying stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So I often get asked what's the most surprising thing about my research, and that was one of them. But basically, in a nutshell, if you ask an average American teenager to name their 5 best friends, and then you go out and interview those same 5 best friends and ask them to do the same thing, on average, fewer than 3 of those are going to be reciprocated. It might be closer to 2. So the average teenager is sending of their 3 best friend nominations, 2 or 3 of those are not reciprocated, which suggests that it doesn't mean they're not friends at all, but it suggests at the very least that they're very imbalanced friendships, and that I think is part of. It certainly is implicated in the dynamic of aggression and how it's being used for social purposes, because these are weak roots in this tree system, and there are kids who are trying to move up and they're destabilizing other kids' relationships as they do it, and they're also their own.
It's so interesting though, because one of the protective factors that experts always put out there is having a few good friends.
Yeah.
But
that's true. I do think that's true. It's just really uncommon for kids to have really good, a few good friends. And one of the interesting things that we're exploring now with some of my students is we're looking at the stability of friendships over time, and that really has a strong effect on all kinds of outcomes. Right now, we're working on a paper about suicide attempts and threats to harm people with a weapon. And one of the strong, these are really unusual events and rare, fortunately, but one of the strong, and they're hard to predict, but one of the strong predictors is the stability of their personal friendships over time. But we see that, we've thrown the book at, the kitchen sink at this, and there are a few kids in a typical school that will maintain the same friends over time, are not seeming to care about the status competition, popularity contests, and they are very well rooted and they are well adjusted.
even if that matchup doesn't happen, if your perception is that you are part of a solid friendship, that's enough?
Those tend to be correlated though. You see higher reciprocity with the kids who are
Okay.
in those stable relationships. Yeah.
Okay, phew. That's good to know. Okay, so how about in the bullying scenario, what about the kid with less social capital, who's like kind of the kid that, you know, we would say, quote unquote, most likely to be the victim? Is that true?
Yes, that is. And that's something I refer to as normative targeting. So there are kids who are kind of different in one way or another, and they're not conforming to, you know, some of the unwritten rules of adolescent life, and they get picked on for it. And that's probably the, you know, among the most common form of bullying, and it's the most obvious. It's the one, you know, and it's kind of purposeless, except insofar that it helps shield the ones who are engaging in it from attention. You know, they've managed to focus the attention on somebody else. And that's I think where the, you know, the classic, you know, the kind of the cliche about like the bullies being insecure, you know, comes from, is that there is some I think some truth to that you know, the ones out front on that are the ones who are not necessarily as socially skilled. They certainly don't get the, you know, the kind of status benefits from engaging in that behavior. But
it's so interesting, because if you think about the adults we love, they're quirky, right? Like they're out there, and the ones who are successful, like in certain like music industries or acting, like those people, they were probably in that category in high school, and now we covet them. It's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, and on the flip side, you know, I challenge you to find any successful person in your social world who will say, "Oh, I was really popular in high school." You know, no one. It's not a badge of honor. Everybody kind of recognizes that wasn't necessarily the best thing. You know, true or not, they're not going to admit to it. In my experience, everybody talks about how, oh, I was nerdy. I had nerdy friends. That's the cool thing.
I know, it's so funny. It's so funny.
Yeah.
Okay, so that kid who's a little different, walks to a different beat, has a probably harder time socially in high school. Is there a kind of like the most likely aggressor? What does that person look like?
Yeah, probably someone who's you know, in that sort of that pattern. It's going to be someone who is also vulnerable to you know, being marginalized, and that pattern of aggression, I think, is one where, you know, you've got kids on the social margins attacking even ever more marginal you know, victims.
Wow.
And I think there's also probably, these are the kids, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that, you know, that psychological, you know, psychopathology is implicated in aggressive behavior, and I think that's very true. And I think this is where that shows up. You know, the kids who have, you know, problematic home lives, the kids who have, you know, some empathy deficits, maybe some impulse control. Those are the kids who are doing these sorts of things. And so I think that's where that literature really rings true. And what I focus on is the second pattern. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you have this whole other category that I think is so interesting, where it's almost like more likely to be in your own friend circle where this is happening. So why is that the case?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's not obvious. And in fact, when we were collecting the data a long time ago, I saw the numbers come in. I saw the networks, and we're asking kids to tell us who their best friends are. And I'm seeing, you know, they have a 4-digit code for that friend. And I was so excited, because this is the first time this kind of data had ever been collected. And I was looking at these, just the hand bubble sheets back then we used, you know, bubble sheets and Scantron forms, and then I would go down to the bullying thing, and I was just eyeballing, and I would see the same numbers. I was like, oh my gosh, we've screwed this up. There's some mistake. Kids are interpreting the question wrong. But you know, then, you know, I was kind of worried. It was like, this can't be true. It can't be that, you know, maybe occasionally, but no. And then I looked at, there was a website, I don't know if it's still around, but there was a website called bullying.org, and on it provided kids to talk about an opportunity to talk about a little space to talk about, offer their narratives of their experiences. And I started looking at that, and I saw that, maybe 1 out of 3 or more, where there certainly the majority of ones where there were narratives where they were talking about who was doing it. It was the kids they thought were their friends, or the kids who were friends after school but not in school. Or their stories of betrayal, like all of a sudden their friends turned on them. And so that made me feel like, okay, this is not an error. This is something real and should be explored. And that took me about, I don't know, a decade maybe before I got that paper out. It came out last January. But yeah, we tried to test that and to see where the greatest risk was, because we have the social maps of the school, we have the kids naming who their friends are, we have that web of relationships, and then we could overlay that with the web of bullying relationships. So we could ask not just who's a bully and who's a victim, but who is bullying whom. And it turns out that we found that the greatest risk is between friends, which makes sense if you think about bullying as a instrumental behavior that it's a tool to climb ladders. Who are our rivals? Often our own friends. We're competing for the same relationships with the same social positions, and sometimes that can get nasty. And that's what we found.
Okay, so it does, the way you explain it makes sense. Sadly, I mean, we don't want to hear that story. We want a different story. But you did ask the question, if bullying yields higher social status, why aren't there more bullies?
Yeah. So I've spent all this time trying to make a case for the second pattern of understanding bullying, that that it's not just big kids beating up vulnerable kids. It's also stuff that's going on, like little nasty comments on Instagram, and it's by directed at popular kids by other popular kids. And so there's this other process of using bullying as a way to climb social ladders. And then I did another paper where I tested whether that worked. Of the kids who are doing this, climbing the social ladder, and I found, and I used yearbooks actually because yearbooks have a nice sort of kind of gold standard indicators of status. Who are the prom royalty, prom queens, prom kings, and so on. And I went back in time and I looked at what they were doing in their sophomore year to predict how they turned out in their senior year yearbooks. And the kids who were more aggressive, and particularly aggressive towards certain other types of kids, high status kids and kids who are themselves aggressive, they were much more likely to be mentioned as, actually to be in the social circles of these elite kids. So it didn't make them better looking, but it did make them more likely to be friends with the good looking kids. So it works, right? It's effective for them. But then that raises a paradox. So lots of kids, want status, we assume. And so if bullying is a way to get it, why aren't more kids doing it? Because every published study on bullying finds only a small fraction, or minority of kids are engaged with it at any time. So there could certainly be more, and why aren't there? And it turns out that so I tried to explore this paradox with a student of mine, and what we found is that there are twin objectives. A lot of kids care about popularity, but they also care about having. I'm off camera. Sorry. They also care about having a close group of friends, and those two goals are kind of at odds with each other. So you can't. To status climb, you have to leave some friends behind as you make new ones, and those new friends are less likely to provide the same kind of emotional support because there's no history there. So and some kids, and actually it turns out we overestimate how much kids want to be popular, and a lot of kids are content to just focus on the friends that they have. But what was cool is that those attitudes or those orientations are reinforced by their network position. So we found that kids who cared about having a close group of friends were more likely to retain those friends in the next time period. And then retaining those friends reinforce that, intensify that preference for having close friends versus popularity. And the opposite was true for kids who wanted status. The kids who wanted to be popular became more popular. They were less likely to retain the same friends. They were more likely to become popular. And gaining status made them value status more. And it also is what drives a lot of aggressive behavior. But fortunately, there were more kids who wanted to have close friends and valued that. Almost no one cares about that more than cares about popularity more than having close friends. And so, some care about them equally, but most kids care more about the close friendships than they do about status. So
it's interesting because the visual is like climbing to the top is literally on top of other people, right? Like you've got to push other people down to elevate your status. And that visual to me is so aggressive.
Yeah. And it's what we saw, like in that earlier paper with the yearbooks, we found that the kids who were the victims of that aggressive, that bullying in their sophomore year were highly unlikely to ever make it into those social circles. They got kicked out.
So one other dynamic is like in the friendship, someone changes, right? And it could be like big weight loss for somebody, so they physically look different, or maturing younger, and so your athletic prowess has gotten much stronger. Does that fit into the same narrative, or is that like where friendships can start to be competitive?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything like that can destabilize a relationship. And kids, they get used to things the way they are. They get set, and then all of a sudden there's some exogenous change. Like you said, puberty, or somebody gets into some elite sports team or class, and that creates a wedge. Anything can destabilize an adolescent, a friendship in middle school or high school. And the trick, and then that can precipitate a lot of cruelty. But the trick, and that's why the kids, who are the few kids who really maintain over a long period of time the same friends, they've gone through all of that. It's not like they didn't have those conflicts and stuff. They learned how to manage them and repair and navigate those changes. And that's a really useful life skill. I think that's really at the heart. I mean, of course, they're different than they already have a bunch of other differences. If they're able to maintain friends over a long period of time in that life period of the life course, they're already going to be different. But I think the friendships themselves are also having there's a learning effect and a growth effect that occurs there for those kids.
Yeah, the more successful you are socially, the more successful you become socially. Like it does build on itself. Okay, so you started this research well before any kids of your own were in sight. So now, as you continue this research and you raise these two adorable children, does it make you nervous what you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm nervous about what lies ahead, but I'm also, I'm supposedly, an expert in this, but I don't know how to, it's already started in preschool. There's already kind of a mean girl thing that's been happening with my daughter, and, she's 5 years old, and I don't have, I think some good long-term strategies, but I don't have any great, short, there's no fixes. No parent, can just change that. You can help kids, navigate the pain. You can help them strategize for how to handle these things, but you can't stop it. And teachers can't stop it. All you can do is, hopefully prevent it from getting worse and, escalating beyond control. But it's a painful part of growing up. I mean, I got the shit. I mean, I don't know, the stuff.
You're
okay, all right. I got, it was every couple of days, there were some neighborhood bullies that, I would change which bus stop I would use to come home from school. And, half the time I would get it wrong, and they would be waiting in some bushes, and, I'd come home with a bloody nose, and it was just part of, I was just like a slow moving antelope on the Serengeti, and those are a couple of young lions that were just, that was just the way of life. And my parents struggle with that. But there's just a limited amount that we can do, and we have to accept that.
I mean, it's interesting because your research is about what exists. It's not about what solutions as a sociologist. So now you're confronted with all this information, and you're kind of on a level playing field with the rest of us.
Right.
But you did say that you have long-term strategies. So tell us a little bit about what you believe those long-term strategies should be.
Yeah. So the two main things is to, in my view, that I would prioritize, and I am investing it with my kids, is to first try to make sure that your kids are able to make friendships outside of school. That's, having a diversified friendship portfolio is a good thing, so that, because a school, a kid can feel like the entire school is against them, and that, and then that's, I think, a pretty precarious moment for kids, because they feel like this is never going to end. This is the school, this social moment is never going to end, and then school itself is going to go on forever. High school seems like it goes forever to kids, and only in retrospect did they realize how fast it went by. So they feel very stuck, and if they have an outlet, they have some good friendships who are not, friends who are not implicated in all that. I think that's a good thing. And I also am going to, what I've learned from my work is that, the kids who are able to sustain, good friendships over time, who know what it is to be a good friend and what to expect from a friendship. Because obviously I've seen a lot of bad friendships, abusive ones, and ones that are very imbalanced. But the good friendships that are sustained over time are really, that's the best preventative medicine for bullying. It reduces the likelihood that it will occur, and it also makes it easier to deal with when it does.
So that, unfortunately, is not like a wish it and it will happen.
No,
right?
So how does it work? And it takes an attitude that you're going to stick with an attitude of loyalty, that you're going to stick with your friends, even if you have social opportunities, with upwardly mobile social opportunities. Maybe you have a chance to, be the starting quarterback, to go with some cliches, but you have an interest in Dungeons and Dragons, and you could, it would be easy to drop those Dungeons and Dragons friends in the favor of your football friends. But the kids who don't, our research suggests, are better off
keeping them both.
Yeah, or prioritizing the older ones. If there's sometimes you have to make choices. You can't, like, some kids are able to navigate and span all these different social worlds, but sometimes I think you probably have to make choices, and there's a limited amount of time. If you want to have a high quality friendship, you can't have 200 of them.
What can you have? Do you know the answer to that?
My rule of thumb is that if I come away with any particular phase of life with 3 or 4 lifelong friends, that's great. And that's kind of where things have been, a couple in high school, a couple in college, a couple in graduate, a few in grad school.
Yeah.
In my current, job, and that's great.
There's not enough emotional bandwidth to have more than that, right?
You can have a 500 Instagram followers, or you can have a few good friends that you go on some great, you have a deeper volume of stories, rather than a wider number of people that have stories with.
Okay, here's my last question.
Okay.
What's the good news?
Well, I think we've kind of covered a little bit of it, but the good news is that high school ends. I mean, I think that's the first thing, is that it does end. And then, and what we start to see actually is kind of interesting. Kids start to see the end. You know, in their senior year, you see this dip in aggressive behavior, and I think that what's happening there is kids are sort of realizing that the popularity contest is over. You know, people are going to go their separate ways. Why be a jerk now? What's the point? And so yeah, that's one good news. One bit of good news, I think, that's important. And I wish kids saw earlier, you know, that this is just a temporary phase. But the second being that, you know, the lessons that we can learn from good friendships that are sustained. That's, I think, good news, that it's not like there's no help, and there's nothing that can prevent this. You can develop some protective armor, I guess. And the third is that, you know, the kids, that these attitudes are self-reinforcing with you know, the kids who you know, more kids are prioritizing close friends over time, and they're acting accordingly. So it's just, I think it's hard. I mean, it's still few of them actualize that, but a lot of them have that orientation and they're headed in that direction. And I think you know, schools, it would be great if schools, you know, I think schools wittingly or unwittingly reinforce these social pyramids in ways that are damaging, and they could do a lot more to. I mean, they celebrate the, you know, the cliche being, you know, men, you know, boys football and girls cheerleading, or maybe whatever it could be. You know, you could swap out other sports in different schools, but there's always one activity,
right,
usually a boys' sport, that is celebrated above all else. That, you know, and that the community is invested in, and there's actually nothing, you know, official for any of the other kids, or a lot of the other kids, to do. And I think schools could, you know, instead of a pyramid, they could be creating a kind of a tide pool environment where lots of kids have a club or an activity that's school sponsored and celebrated, that where they can find the kinds of friends that have the same interests, and hopefully, you know, sustain those friendships.
Okay, Dr. Robert Faris, thank you so much for being here with us. I love your research. I can't wait to find out what you're doing next.
Thank you, Sue. I really enjoyed talking to you.